Welcome to the ATP Project. You're with your host, Steve and Nicole. And today we're talking about something we've never spoken about, and I can't believe that.
I can't believe it either, actually.
Like, we've never done a podcast on this particular protein.
That's right.
Because we're talking about protein today, and everyone goes, oh, it must be good. It's like, no, it's the bad protein.
It can be bad protein.
Yeah.
And this is the whole debate about this.
I know, it's protein.
Is it evil or is it not evil, Steve? That's the question.
That's what people say about me.
That you're evil?
Or not evil.
Or not evil.
You know, Dr.
Yeah, well, I guess
Jekyll
it
and
depends
Mr.
what day
Hyde.
we get you, really, isn't it? Some days, yeah.
Today I'm good because I'm fired up.
You are fired up.
I'm fired up because
All
of...
the good things.
Shameless plug.
Shameless plug. Yeah. So, yeah, we're talking about gluten.
Gluten. Gluten. So not glutes, the thing you sit on.
Not the glutes.
Gluten. It's a protein found in grains.
Yeah.
But we're talking about wheat. And the classic four: wheat, oats, rye, and barley.
Yep.
And gluten is a protein found in those grains. Now, it's very interesting because everyone's heard of the gluten-free diet, but has anyone heard of celiac disease?
Well, that's it. Celiac disease seems to be quite well known.
Yep.
But for some reason, and the reason that we wanted to do this is because gluten, people who are gluten-free, and it's kind of, the podcast is kind of be gluten-free.
Yep.
Benefits of, is there any benefit to it? Are people just crazy for being gluten-free, and should they be put in a padded room? Because that's the way a lot of people seem to make it out. Like, if you're gluten-free, they kind of scoff at you unless you have celiac disease. So we kind of want to bust a few myths about gluten-free being a waste of time. So that's kind of the premise of it, that, a lot of the medical professions still think if you don't have celiac disease, then there is no issue with gluten.
So we've got this area called celiac disease, which have to be gluten-free or you're very sick. So there's this grey area where these people are sensitive to it, but they're not exactly celiac disease.
That's right.
So it's kind of like a weird grey area. And we're going to discuss grey area because, celiac disease, if you have, actually I work with a lady whose husband was severe celiac and she got him really sick one day, trying to kill him, I think.
Oh, God.
No, she cut her sandwiches on a breadboard and wiped down the breadboard and then he put his gluten-free on there, used the same knife.
Oh, really?
Believe it or not, and got really sick and had to go to hospital.
Yeah, that's crazy.
Just from that. Yeah, because you got a call from work and... she had to go to hospital because he was in hospital.
Wow. Yeah, celiac disease is very serious. So obviously 100% gluten avoidance in that case.
Yes.
But we will talk about maybe some other people that being gluten-free actually can be beneficial.
Yeah.
When should you maybe be gluten-free and do you need to be gluten-free, and the reasons why perhaps it's been vilified so much for people who are gluten-free.
Yep.
We'll have a look at all of that sort of thing. So
let's get some raw numbers.
Yeah, so let's get some numbers. So
celiacs, how many celiacs are there in Australia?
So in Australia, I struggled to find the specific stats on this because they varied a little bit. So I've gone with kind of an average, and you'd be surprised at the numbers, at 1 in 70.
That's
roughly.
a lot.
That is a lot, isn't it?
So
that has celiac disease.
70 people here. I don't know how many people who work here
in
this little area, but not the other area, but I'm going to say 70 plus all the...
Probably,
50. Oh,
50,
there
you go.
So probably one of those is a celiac
quite
person.
Possibly. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, so that's quite a lot in Australia. And in the US, but only 20% of those are diagnosed.
Wow.
So there's a lot walking around with celiac disease that are undiagnosed. So that's a whole issue in itself. And in the US, because we obviously don't we have viewers and listeners from other countries.
Screw them.
Screw them. We'll talk about the US. In the US, it's 1 in 133. It's actually a little bit lower in the US.
Yeah.
But the numbers seem to be going up.
Yeah. I think I know why, because in Australia, blood tests are typically free if they're referred to by a general practitioner.
Yeah.
And, the antibody test for celiac disease is a free test in Australia if the doctor believes you may have celiac disease.
Yeah.
So that's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah. So crazy how the numbers are going up.
So there's genes that control this thing, obviously.
There is genes that control this. So people who get celiac disease do carry the DQ2 and the DQ8 genes.
Good.
Doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to get the autoimmune condition. Obviously, epigenetics we've talked about in the past, environment Basically, genes load the gun, environment pulls the trigger, is the saying.
I love that saying.
Yeah, it's good, isn't it?
I think I've stolen it off you.
Well, I think I've stolen it off somebody else.
Oh, okay.
I might have stolen it off you, Steve.
Oh, maybe.
We're just going
It's
back and
just
forth.
a really good sort of, you're genetically predisposed to something and then you have this environment. Because let's say you're the most genetically celiac disease person on the planet, but you live in Antarctica as an Inuit or in the Arctic Circle as an Inuit, they're up north. So you wouldn't be exposed to grains.
No, that's right.
So it wouldn't matter at all.
No, it wouldn't matter at all.
So-
And there's other things. There's obviously we've probably talked about autoimmunity in the past. We might do a whole podcast on it.
Duh.
But things like virus, bacterial infections, viral infections can also be triggers. Any sort of gut-related issues can be a trigger. High stress, all that sort of thing. So you need to have those other environmental inputs to actually switch that gene on. So not everyone, if you go out and have genetic testing and you've got that gene, doesn't necessarily mean that you will end up with celiac disease.
Exactly.
You just have to live a healthy, balanced lifestyle, and you're less likely to get these things. But yes.
It's incredible because this is a fairly new disease. And when I say new disease, is that grains have only been consumed by humans large scale but for about the last 10,000 years.
Yeah.
Before that, we're hunter-gathering mainly. But before the widespread use of grains, there could have been heaps of, quote, celiacs that have lived and died and not known any other way. So, this is the last 10,000, because grains are a bit of a fad food.
They are.
Humans have been around for about 1.1 to 1.8 million, depending on which species you want to come from. So let's say 1 million years for mathematic ease.
Yeah.
Then the last 10,000 years of that is 1% of that time. So grains in consumption have been the last one, only for 99% of human history, grains weren't really a food.
No.
1%.
Yeah.
Isn't that amazing?
I think I put stats in here or something.
Oh, you got stats.
About, I got more stats. I can't remember.
Oh, you got stats galore.
But it was basically for the last roughly. I will get to this when I find it. But roughly the last 360-ish generations have been eating grains, gluten-containing grains, things like that.
Oh yeah.
Which sounds like maybe a lot, but then you've got to remember there was I think the stat was over 65,500 generations previous to that.
Yeah,
so literally a blip in time that we've been eating grains and gluten.
That works out to be 5% what you're talking about. So it's a small blip.
Yeah. So evolutionary-wise, our body hasn't really adapted probably. I mean, it's adapted to eating grains, but hasn't really, because we're seeing a lot of issues that we're going to talk about today.
Yeah.
So, and this isn't a pro-gluten-free podcast. This is just a let's look at both sides of it. Let's not just all focus on the gluten-free people are just crazy and there's no reason for them to be on gluten. Let's look at the science around why you could be gluten-free, and then possibly if you even need to be gluten-free and how you can find that out as well.
It's funny because when I personally consume gluten, I don't notice any difference. I don't seem to have any side effects. No. It just doesn't seem to be the one that gets me.
Yeah.
So, as we go back 400 BC, with one man's food being another man's poison from Hippocrates. I mean, that could be the case here.
Yeah, totally.
So is a gluten-free diet good? Yes or no? Maybe. You don't know. So, we just got to talk about the information.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the gut, because that's where it gets into.
Yeah, yeah.
What does it do to the gut?
So, and this is where some of the contention lies, I guess, when we get into a little bit more with autoimmune conditions, and a lot of them are saying all autoimmune conditions start in the gut.
Yep.
We don't know if that's 100% true or not, but it's definitely a quite significant driver, even if it's not the entire driver of the onset of autoimmunity.
Yep.
But the particular connection with gluten and the gut is that it can create intestinal hyperpermeability, which we've talked about in the past. So hyperpermeability.
Yeah,
hyperpermeability. So that means overly permeable, because our gut has to be a little bit permeable all the time, because we have to nutrients have to get into our system, our bloodstream, through some means. So we have something called tight junctions, or gap junctions, some people call them, that line our gut, and they're like just the little plaques, little shields that line, and there's like little microscopic gaps between them, and that's what allows nutrients to go through into our bloodstream where they need to be, but it keeps out any bigger proteins, antigens, anything like that. So what gluten does, triggers the release of a protein called zonulin in our gut. And so what zonulin does is it widens those gap junctions.
Yeah.
So it creates larger holes. And then obviously that allows the food from your gut to move through into your bloodstream, which can create an immune response.
Yeah.
Because your body's going, hang on a minute, that's not supposed to be in here. It's supposed to be from in the gut, which is outside the body essentially, not inside. So it mounts an immune response. But then if you think about it, if you're eating gluten 3 times a day, which a lot of people might eat cereal or toast for lunch. They might have a sandwich for dinner. They might have sandwich for lunch, pasta for dinner.
Welcome to Australia.
Possibly, yeah. They might have their snacks, crackers, lots of things. So that's at least 3 times a day, more if you're having snacks as well. So those gap junctions are continually open because that zonulin is continually activated. So an immune system's going to react. And what happens when our immune system reacts again and again and again, it becomes hyperstimulated as well, which in the case of autoimmunity is when your immune system is just going too much and then it gets confused and it can start attacking its own tissue. So autoimmunity means attacking self.
Jeez.
So that's kind of that gluten connection with intestinal hyperpermeability.
Yes.
So, and that's where and we'll talk a little bit more about with autoimmunity, where that comes into play with autoimmune conditions. And a lot of people, are told, don't eat gluten if you have an autoimmune condition. That's one of the reasons why. So it's not specifically, in some cases possibly, but not specifically that it's going to cause an autoimmune condition or the continuation specifically of the gluten on the autoimmune condition, but it's creating hyperpermeability, which is creating a trigger in the immune system, which then can cause worsening of autoimmune conditions. So for that reason alone, I always recommend if anyone has an autoimmune condition to take gluten out because you don't want that extra inflammatory trigger. Yeah. So, it's
absolutely true. And it's funny because always, when you talk about zonulins and gap junctions, that's all great science. When I studied naturopathy last century.
Yes.
It was last century.
Were there grains around back then, Steve?
No, they were just coming in.
Just coming in.
Just coming in. But we used to talk about a disease called leaky gut syndrome. We didn't really understand it. But we understood that there was some leaking going on, and there was iridology science, and it was all for me a bit fluffy, a bit sort of like, what are you talking about, leaky gut syndrome? What's leaking? It's like supposed to leak, and it's like what? But this is what they're sort of talking about. That the old naturopaths and the old herbalists from the old days used to talk about what they would see in the clinic, and they would say, when you eat this food, something happened and it caused this, and it was all a bit fluffy. But now we've figured it out. We've got it. This is published in the medical literature, and I remember even very recently, and I was working for ATP at the time, where I had to write a post that saying there's no evidence for leaky gut syndrome, and the gut can't leak and blah 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 blah. So I talked about zonulins and posted studies on it. So even recently, there's still people who believe that this doesn't exist.
There's still a lot of people that believe it doesn't exist. So and I think that the terms change. So now we don't say leaky gut, we say gut hyperpermeability, because that sort of describes it a little bit better. Because
it's true. It's
true, because our gut is, as I said, slightly permeable, but hyper means that it's overly permeable, too permeable. Yeah. So, and I think zonulin, it was Alicia Folano, I probably got that name wrong.
Oh, big name dropper there.
Yeah, he discovered zonulin, I think it was about 10 years or so ago. And then from then, the research has gone crazy. Now they're going, this is the reason why we have these issues with that.
I've got a great paper we'll talk about later, but it's published. I don't look at it now and go, woohoo, it's just an accepted fact.
Yeah, it is. And I think a lot of the medical profession, orthodox medical profession, is coming around to a degree, but there are still a lot that aren't.
Yeah, I know.
And so, they say, your diet has nothing to do with your autoimmune condition. We all know that's not right. So, and so the intestinal permeability, hyperpermeability, is one reason where avoiding gluten, if you have any inflammatory condition, autoimmune condition, could be a good idea. So there's that reason. But celiac disease.
Did I tell you when I had an autoimmune disease?
Yes.
What happened to me with gluten?
Yes. But tell everyone again, Steve. This is a cool story.
It's just a funny story when I had ankylosing spondylitis pretty bad. I know you can't get rid of it, and I'm supposed to be a cripple, but I've got rid of it. I don't think I've got it anymore. But I certainly had it. I was in hospital and certainly had all the blood tests, all positive, everything was, all the scans and everything. But I used to eat pizzas on Sunday night when I was 20 with my family. I was living at home then. And on the Monday, the back. It was like, blinding pain. And still remember it. And I said to the doctor, eating pizza got something to do with my arthritis, and it's full of tomato and ham and arachidonic acid and gluten and you name it, it's
in it, yeah.
And he said, no, it's not. It's probably because you were eating it on the floor. You got to sit at the table and eat it.
Oh, wow. So a 20-year-old sitting on the floor for 20 minutes, half an hour is going to hurt your back.
Well, I used to sit on like a beanbag because that was the best thing for my back. But isn't it funny? It's like, no. And this was a rheumatologist. This was not like, but again, that was 34 years ago.
Yeah.
So things have changed.
Significantly. Thank goodness. Thank goodness they've changed.
So, all right. So it does zonulin stuff to your gut. You absorb more, so you should get more muscly. Is that the whole thing? Or?
Well, that'd be nice.
No, it doesn't work that way.
It doesn't work that way. So we all know, obviously, celiacs can't eat gluten, but there is a whole other subset of people that can't eat gluten. This is where the grey area comes in, and a lot of medical professionals say, no, if you test negative for celiac disease, that's it. You don't have a problem with gluten, so move on. It's all in your head.
Yep.
Yeah, but you tell that to the people that are having significant symptoms. So non-celiac gluten sensitivity is a condition.
Non-celiac gluten sensitivity. So you're sensitive to gluten, but you haven't got celiac.
But you haven't got celiac, right. Yeah. So, but because there is no test, there is a test, but it's very hard to get. Yeah. To test for any other sensitivities, of course, they're very limited in their testing, as you said, very basic testing. So, of course, you're going to test negative if you don't have celiac disease. So they say, well, there's nothing wrong with you. Yeah. It's not gluten. Gluten's not the problem. You're not reacting to gluten.
Knock yourself out.
Exactly. So some of the symptoms of non-celiac gluten sensitivity, and they're very vast. They can be very vast. But bloating or gas, so a lot of digestive issues, obviously, nausea, stomach pain, diarrhea, constipation, those types of things. But then headaches, fatigue, joint pain, brain fog, poor concentration, and we're going to talk about cognitive issues.
Brain stuff,
that type of thing. They can be another lot of symptoms that people can have when they react to, or when they eat gluten.
And that sounds like every disease on the planet.
Just about,
So it's sort of like, the only way to know is to cut it out and test it.
Exactly, and we'll talk about it at the end. I mean, there is a very simple way, people, to test if you're sensitive to gluten or not, instead of going through this up and down.
And there's a few other symptoms that you want to talk about
so we can go through a lot of the symptoms. But this is really fascinating. So I researched this, did a research on this, but this is very fascinating. So what I probably should premise is non-celiac gluten sensitivity should we also call it non-celiac wheat sensitivity. Because in wheat there is obviously gluten, but there is also other proteins.
I know.
So there's 4 different epitopes, which are types of classes of gluten. So there's beta, gamma, and omega as well. So we don't test for all of those. And these ones are a bit harder to say. So it also contains agglutins.
Agglutins, yep.
So they are proteins that bind to the sugar.
To sugars, yep.
And then prodinolphins.
Oh, yeah.
So they're involved in the cellular communication.
Yep, they're just communicating between the cells.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. So when we eat wheat, it's broken down. There's enzymes in the digestive tract called transglutaminases.
Yes.
And they break down the wheat compound.
Right. Sounds good so far.
Yeah. So when everything's getting broken down and processed, more proteins are formed.
Yep.
Including deaminated gliadin and gliadendorphins.
Oh, that sounds interesting.
Right, so that's all a mouthful. I had to read that because it was all a mouthful. But here's the difference, right? So between celiacs and non-celiac gluten-sensitive people or non-celiac wheat-sensitive people.
Wow, yeah.
So celiac disease is characterised by an immune response to the alpha-gliadin and transglutaminase type 2.
Yep.
So that's what celiacs are reacting to, right? So, and that's generally what's tested. Sure. And that's all that's tested.
Not the other ones.
That's not the other ones at all. But people may not react to those, but they may react to some of the other compounds of the wheat or the gluten.
Wow.
Including the other types, so the beta, the gamma, or the omega.
Omega-gliadin, yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
So if you're reacting to omega-gliadin badly, you're going to test negative on a celiac.
Exactly, and they say, well, you're fine, there's nothing wrong with you.
Jeez.
So that's kind of where the difference, and there's also different types of transglutaminase as well. So there's type 2, obviously there's type 3, which is found primarily in the skin.
Yep.
Type 6 is found primarily in the brain, Steve.
Oh, I'm going to get to the brain.
We're going to get to that.
Yeah.
So therein lies a problem. So people are saying, if the doctors are saying you're not testing positive for celiac, so you're fine, they could well be having sensitivities or triggers from some of these other subgroups.
Yep.
But who's going to know? So, and I think that's where a lot of these other conditions and symptoms come into play, that they're reacting more to these other proteins.
It's incredible because you've got to remember the average Australian, and I'll pick on Australians here, a very common cereal here, I'm giving a brand name here, is wheat Bix. Guess what? Wheat Bix is 99% made from.
Oh, dear, let me think.
Yeah, it's a tough one, isn't it?
It's a tough one.
And I mean, this is a very... wheat in Australia, people can eat it, not just, as you said before, very easily 3 to 4 times a day.
Easily.
Wheat Bix for breakfast, sandwich for lunch, you have your rice, noodles, pasta for dinner, pasta's wheat. I mean, you might have a biscuit that's bound to have wheat in it.
Yeah, all the snacks or the crackers, people the crackers and all the different little snacks and things. So they're getting a lot of it. So that could be where there could be that grey area is sitting. So people are still reacting, but we're not testing for that, so they're not going to know.
Geez, scary, isn't it?
So that was kind of cool when I researched that. And I thought, that makes complete sense.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
All right, so that's real. I love that biochemistry. I love it. Now, let's talk about other autoimmune diseases. Let's talk about diabetes type 1.
Yeah, this is very interesting too. So, people are saying, or the professionals or whoever has been saying forever, gluten and autoimmune conditions, there is no connection whatsoever.
None.
Unless it's celiac. Bear in mind, that's an autoimmune condition.
Yeah.
But apart from that one, gluten has nothing to do with anything else. Gluten and, celiac and type 1 diabetes are very closely related.
Yep.
So they're the same gene types.
Yeah.
So, so they both have the same gene type. So it's not uncommon for someone who has celiac disease to have type 1 diabetes or vice versa. So I think that kind of puts it out there that one autoimmune condition that reacts to gluten does not mean that the rest of all the other, I think there's over 80 or 100 autoimmune conditions, there isn't some issue with gluten or even some kind of driver with gluten as well. So I found that really interesting. So they both have exact same, the HLA, DQ2 and DQ8 gene.
They're common in all sorts of things,
Yeah, they are. So I think even in ankylosing spondylitis, you've got the HLA.
I've got one of those and I've got the HLA B27.
Yeah.
That's my claim to fame one. That's the rare one that's really closely associated with AS, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Or fortunately. Or
it's because you're a high achiever, Steve. You go for the rarest. You
just go for the rare one. It's actually quite common in Japan.
Is it?
Yeah, do I look Japanese?
Oh, I don't know. With my glasses off, maybe.
Maybe, yeah.
Maybe.
No. I mean, it's just a gene. But you got to remember, my family's probably full of that gene. It just never had the triggers.
That's right.
For it, It's like any disease.
Exactly. Yeah. So there is a lot of other conditions that are more common in those that have celiac, more autoimmune conditions.
Really?
That those have celiac have more often. Rheumatoid arthritis.
Well, that's common as heck.
Very common.
Yep.
MS.
MS is multiple sclerosis. It's the demyelination of the brain.
Yep.
A scary disease. Very scary.
Very scary. Terrible. I had a drama teacher when I was at high school that had MS, actually.
Really?
Yeah. She was in a wheelchair. Lovely lady. Hashimoto's, I feel like every second person that I see just about has Hashimoto's.
I was talking to a staff member this morning. I won't mention their name, but they've probably got Hashimoto's.
Yeah, I think I know who you're talking about.
Okay.
Yeah, because I thought the same thing.
Okay.
Autoimmune hepatitis, Addison's disease.
Addison's an adrenal thing.
Yeah. So celiac disease is more common in people that have those autoimmune conditions. So there's a lot of crossover. And we know that anyone that has one autoimmune condition is likely to have another, particularly if they're not well managed, and then another and another. So not uncommon at all. So there is a very strong connection between celiac disease and a lot of others. So is gluten or any of the gluten proteins a possibility to be involved in that somewhat, or a driver of the continuation of the progress of the condition? Who would really know?
Yeah.
And this is really cool too. So this one I actually got from a bit of a resource from Chris Kressler. I better credit him. So some of these autoimmune conditions were, once they went on a gluten-free diet, a lot of these conditions were improved, and there's a lot of them here. So so kidney autoimmune diseases, so membrane proliferative glomerular nephritis.
Yep.
Any hepatic conditions, so of the liver, so celiac hepatitis, hepatic failure, neurological and psychiatric entities, Steve.
Absolutely. There's lots of those.
Yeah, so peripheral neuropathy, Guillain-Barré syndrome, schizophrenia, paranoid type of conditions. So they can all be associated with gluten allergy.
Nuts.
There's dermatological, so any skin issues as well. Endocrinological. Oh my God! Just because I got up at 2 o'clock this morning, my brain is like already.
You're a
it's the
machine.
afternoon.
You're a machine getting up that early.
I was, it wasn't on purpose. Let me tell you.
Oh, geez.
Yeah. So anything to do with the joints, eyes, lots of different conditions that they should to have improvement under a gluten-free diet.
So let's say you've got one of those, and these are serious conditions. You pick some serious ones there. I mean, we're not talking about treatments yet, but this should be lending our brains. Our brains are going somewhere now, aren't they? They're like, okay, so I've got one of those things. Let's say it's like, you got to be considering that gluten could be it could just be making it worse. It may not be causing it, but it could also be just making it worse.
Yeah, it definitely could be, and like I said, it may not be and look, it's probably not. More than likely not the initial driver.
Yeah.
But is it making things worse?
Yeah.
And that's where the contention comes in, where, the medical profession, a lot of the medical profession is saying, you don't need to go gluten-free. That's just a waste of time. It's ridiculous. It's a joke. You don't need to. You don't have celiac disease. You have another autoimmune condition. Gluten's not the issue. Well, we're showing that gluten can be a big problem for these conditions.
And you mentioned thyroid before. I mean, that's a huge thing out there in people. Everyone's got low thyroid, particularly women. Do you want to expand on the thyroid story of thing about gluten and thyroid autoimmunity? Yeah,
so I see a lot of clients with Hashimoto's, and I generally will put them on, well, actually not 100% of the time, I'll put them on gluten-free diet.
Wow.
The reason being, so there's something called molecular mimicry.
Ooh.
So that's when a particular protein looks very similar to another protein. So maybe a protein that we have, and then a protein coming in externally. So the gliadin, which is the protein in gluten, looks very, very similar to a lot of the proteins in that make up the tissues of our thyroid.
Wow.
So so we go back to that hyperpermeability again. So if you're having gluten, it's going into the bloodstream, you already have an immune system that's hyper stimulated, attacking itself. You're putting in gluten, which is inflammatory if it's getting into the bloodstream. It's basically the immune system is getting confused between the gliadin protein and your thyroid. So it's going, oh my God, the gluten's coming in because you've got this hyperpermeability. We need to tag it and destroy it. It's tagging that, and then it's tagging anything that's almost identical, which is thyroid tissue. Yeah. So then you can have destruction of your thyroid gland. Now, I will say it's not always the case.
No.
But why risk it?
Why
not just eliminate the gluten to stop any potential further destruction of your thyroid gland?
Because I'll ask you this now, is there any benefit in consuming gluten?
No, and we're going to get to that.
No.
Because there's a little bit of an argument about that as well, which I found hilarious when I did some research on what the argument was. So gluten and thyroid, I will always say, let's try gluten free. We haven't talked about dairy. This is not about dairy, but but there is kind of a bit of a crossover with those two as well.
Yeah, problems there too.
Yeah. So this is a really cool one, Steve. So you've got a really cool paper on gluten and neurological symptoms.
Sometimes you fluke symptoms. On them. This is published in Cells 2021, and it's called, and I'll even love the title.
Yeah, it's good, isn't it?
Let Food Be Thy Medicine, Gluten and the Potential Role in Neurodegeneration. And it sort of like says, it goes on to saying that, look, yes, gluten can stuff your brain up big time, cause neurodegeneration. I love the name diseases now. This is the diseases that have been associated and may benefit from gluten withdrawal. Okay. Now look at the list. I've got to pick a few out. It's almost all of them.
Yeah.
The top two are Alzheimer's, cognitive impairment, and Parkinson's.
Wow.
There's three. Sorry. Then you've got the neuropsychiatric, anxiety, depression, foggy mind, schizophrenia, autism, psychosis, bipolar.
Wow.
Yeah.
Named a lot
Then
of
you got
those.
autoimmune disease of the brain, multiple sclerosis, autoimmune hypopituitarism, gluten ataxia, never heard of that one, autoimmune uveitis, which is the in the eye there, and miscellaneous. It can also trigger migraines, epilepsy, and headaches. And these are all peer-reviewed papers have found these links.
There you go.
That's just like
that's crazy.
all of them.
Yeah, it's pretty much all of them.
It's all of them. It's like even things like foggy mind. I mean, they've put that in there too.
Yeah, well, brain fog. Well, we have not talking about specifically about grains, but grain brain. This is a pretty common term.
Well, Grain Brain's that book by Dr. David. I've got his name.
Yes, you wrote it down somewhere.
I wrote his name down.
Yeah.
But we'll get to him later because this is all in the brain.
Yeah.
And Dr. David's a neurologist too, so he's pretty up to that. But fancy having, and you might be thinking to yourself, okay, I eat a piece of toast, how does it get into my brain?
That's right.
I mean, it's a bit of a wild thing. Now, in this paper, they have one of those wonderful, you and I love these charts that there's loads of literature and they summarise down to a picture. Yeah. And the picture tells 1,000, 1,000,000 words.
This one a lot.
And I don't know how to describe this picture, but it's got the gut and the brain, and they talk about the gut-brain axis. I'm showing to the camera. But as I said, this picture is absolutely amazing. It starts off with eating wheat. Turns into the gluten. The gluten gets gliadin, leaks into the bloodstream, okay? And then the immune system comes out, the antigen-presenting cells grab it and trigger an inflammatory response because it's a foreign protein. It could be a virus trying to kill you. It could be a bacteria trying to kill you. It's just a stupid, bit of protein.
Yeah.
But the body doesn't know. It's a foreign protein. That's what it targets. So it shoots off all these chemical messengers which destroy GABA, serotonin, dopamine, and norepinephrine, all the neurotransmitters, drives up the HP axis and drives up inflammation. And that all affects directly the brain because across the blood-brain barrier, all these things, and you stuff your brain out. So the gluten, you don't eat the wheat and it gets stuck into your temporal lobe.
It's travelling its way up to the brain.
Via different chemical messages.
Yeah.
It's like, my cigarette lighter here, let's say I've got one, and I'll just put it up against this bush here. It's just a cigarette lighter. And you could burn down half the forest with that because it's just one little thing that gets across and it just opens it up and literally destroys your brain.
Yeah.
Now, you might be thinking I'm being a bit melodramatic here, but they're all published in this particular review paper.
Yep.
So it's remarkable that, okay, so, these diseases are like, everyone's got them. Everyone's got them. And you just think, it's just so how do you not treat a neurological disease by getting rid of gluten out of their diet?
Yeah. Yeah, or at least trialling it. And so, then we have another paper. We probably don't have time to read it. Another paper on gluten and dermatitis or any skin issues, any sort of particular skin issues. There's a lot of research to show. We've got a paper here.
Yeah, that's crazy, that paper.
Yeah, so this one's a systematic review from Dermatology Online Journal. You can put the link up to that one as well.
Yeah.
But in this one, it goes into so many different conditions. So, we've got ones on atopy, which is dermatitis.
Yep.
Vitiligo, again, which is it's kind of a patchy, the skin goes kind of a patchy colour. Oh, you got another autoimmune condition.
Oh, it's just, possibly. Got every other freaking disease.
Psoriasis is another one.
Haven't got that.
Haven't got that one, no. In all of these reviews, they were put on gluten-free diets and their symptoms significantly reduced.
Yeah.
So, and that's all in a research paper as well.
And I read that paper, and the conclusion's beautiful because dermatologists always ask, what can I do in my diet to fix my skin? And that they say that this is something you can do, get rid of the stupid grains out of their diet. Yeah,
exactly. So for a lot of people, that can be really helpful. I've seen clients with dermatitis where we've gone gluten-free and they've gone gluten-free and it's helped, and others that it hasn't. But I also have a theory about the reasons why things don't, which I'll talk about at the end as well. But they don't help when you take out gluten. So there's so many. I mean, here's another list here. So a lot of observational studies have linked gluten intolerance to so many symptoms and conditions.
That's all of them again,
and this is loads, like irritable bowel syndrome, fibromyalgia, dermatitis, as we said, multiple sclerosis, schizophrenia, depression, as we said, autism spectrum disorders, Meniere's disease.
Yeah.
I've had Meniere's.
Do you?
I don't anymore. I did.
Oh,
I did.
How'd that make you feel?
Terrible. Oh, that's horrendous.
Worst disease. People get,
it's horrendous.
Ruins their life.
Yeah, it was horrendous. I got it after, I got it when I was training to compete, actually.
Oh.
Yeah, interesting. But I only had it for a month. And then I did some witchy poo stuff. No, I did some herbs and some other things that would help, and it never came back. So I got rid of it. Endometriosis as well. So there's just so many different conditions that they've associated with gluten being a factor.
The list there, I went, oh, God, we can't even go through all that.
We can't even go through all that. There's just too many. But
what about the statement that removing gluten, means you're going to be moving grains, is going to cause deficiencies?
So this one made me laugh. It just made me laugh because they're basically saying if you take gluten out of the diet, you're going to end up with nutrient deficiencies. Yeah. So let's look at that for a second, shall we?
No, very quick second.
So this is the stats I had. So humans have been eating gluten for the last 367 generations, like I said in the beginning, but there's 65,500 generations previous to that. So we haven't been eating gluten for very long, or wheat, or those type grains. So gluten-containing grains, what are the nutrients in that? Literally, what are we looking at?
Nothing.
Nothing.
Like people say, fibre. It's a pretty bad form of fibre.
It's a pretty bad form of fibre. We can get fibre from a lot of different places. Compared to a diet that's full of fruits and vegetables, lean proteins, eggs, nuts and seeds, that type of thing, they're saying that if you don't have gluten in there, you're going to be nutrient deficient.
Well, my nuts are gluten-free.
They are nuts are gluten-free, Steve.
Yeah.
So could have gone a whole podcast without a nut joke.
Well, it's pretty good. We're about three-quarters of the way through the damn podcast.
That's true. You did hold out.
Nuts for ages.
That's right. So compared to a diet that is full of highly processed, refined carbohydrates, which wheat is. So I feel like that statement that it's dangerous to take it out of your diet is quite ridiculous. If you're eating, it's just ridiculous. We can't even say any more than that.
It actually improves nutrition, because I know you got a paper here saying that it doesn't cause any problems, but if you cut out all that flour and crap, because most people eat it in the form of flour.
Yeah.
Let's face it, call it flour, Weet-Bix flour, bread flour, it's all flour. Yeah. Get rid of that and just substitute that with all those foods you said.
Yeah.
Way better off.
So much better off.
Oh,
yeah.
And gluten-free.
Exactly. So it's a ridiculous ridiculous statement. I can't even go any further with it. So there is a little bit of a study here where they did a study on is a gluten-free diet nutrient deficient. So this one, it was a small study, 37 patients. So the conclusion was a gluten-free diet has minimal deficiencies similar to those present in the diet with gluten, with improvements in lipid profile.
Yeah.
So, healthy fats or lipid profile was much better.
Yeah.
So taking gluten out really didn't change the nutrient density of the diet.
Improves your cardiovascular health.
Exactly, and you had improvements.
So that's gluten, but we've also mentioned wheat.
Yeah.
So this is kind of like a bit of a dichotomy. So what are you sort of talking about here, the gluten or the wheat?
Yeah, so that's the thing. So some people can have a wheat sensitivity, but not a gluten sensitivity.
Right.
And I think that's where lines get blurred as well. So there was a study cited, and we've got the link here as well. It has been cited quite a lot in the media as proof that gluten sensitivity does not exist.
Oh.
It found that a group of patients with irritable bowel syndrome were not sensitive to gluten.
Okay.
So they gave them, there was no difference with they had gluten or didn't have gluten.
Well, IBS. Yeah, anyway, sorry.
Yeah, so that's a whole nother situation. So the researchers who performed this study had previously published a paper showing that IBS patients were sensitive to wheat and that removing wheat from their diet led to improvement of symptoms. However, in this new study, the authors specifically isolated gluten and found that there was no difference in symptoms between the patients eating high gluten diets and those eating low gluten diets, right?
High-low. What about no gluten diet?
Exactly.
Oh.
So, I mean, that's kind of misleading.
Yes.
The study is very misleading. So, and this, again, I took from Chris Kessler's some research that he's done. So, there was a lot in the study that wasn't very clear.
Yeah.
So basically, the study initially was that they examined the effects of gluten in a specific population, so people with irritable bowel syndrome. Yeah. It might be true that gluten sensitivity is no more common in people with IBS than in people without IBS.
True.
But it doesn't overturn a large body of evidence that links non-celiac gluten sensitivity to a variety of health conditions.
Of course.
And another point in this study is it doesn't suggest that people with IBS or anyone else with gluten sensitivity should feel free to start chowing down on wheat. So don't start chowing down on wheat. It suggests the opposite. So for the first week of the trial, all patients were put on a gluten-free diet that was also low in FODMAPs.
Yep.
After this lead-in period, the participants were assigned one of three groups: a high gluten diet, a low gluten diet, and a placebo. So those on the high gluten diet were given 16 grams a day of purified wheat gluten. Those on a low gluten diet were given 2 grams per day of purified wheat gluten, plus 14 grams a day of whey protein isolate.
Right.
And those on the placebo were given 16 grams a day of whey protein isolate only.
Yeah. Okay.
The majority of participants experienced a significant improvement of symptoms during the 7-day gluten-free, low FODMAP lead-in period, but there was no difference in symptoms between the high gluten, low gluten or placebo groups during the subsequent treatment period. In other words, patients did react adversely to wheat, but they did not react to isolated gluten. So they're reacting to wheat but not gluten.
Yeah.
So that's basically saying that there's something in the wheat other than the gluten that people can have sensitivities to.
Yep.
And as we said earlier, there's a lot of different compounds in wheat, not just gluten, that people can be reacting to. So that's not only FODMAPs but the other proteins as well. So they may not be reacting to gluten specifically, which was isolated gluten in this study.
Yeah.
But they may still have an issue with the wheat.
Yeah,
so they may still have an issue
carbohydrate
with
content or something.
Yeah, so the other proteins in the wheat.
Yeah.
So it's kind of misleading to say that the gluten diet.
Incredibly misleading.
Because they weren't giving them straight wheat, they were giving them isolated gluten. It's very misleading.
I've got a nice study here on gluten and the bowels too. Basically, it gives you bowel cancer.
Well, that's not
conclusions.
Just a dead silence there.
Just reading part of the conclusion. The positive association of gluten intake with the risk of proximal colon cancer deserves further study. Does it?
Does it? Jeez.
Does it?
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, this is a published paper where association between grains, gluten and the risk of colorectal cancer in the Cancer Prevention Study 2, a nutrition cohort. So quite a major study published in the European Journal of Nutrition 2020. So a little bit of a problem with that. This is like over 100,000 people in this study. So it's quite a big study. It increased the risk of proximal cancer by 37%.
Wow, that's pretty big.
It's pretty big.
Yeah.
So, like if you're going to be, gluten will be all right. Okay, well, just wait. And it's proximal because the proximal is the closest colon to the small intestine. So if some leaks through, it'll smash the large intestine, the first bit.
Yeah.
So,
that's not good.
I mean, I don't know what to say about that, except that, gee whiz, you just be very careful if you're still at the end of this podcast thinking, it should be all right, I'll go for it.
Yeah, if you've got bowel cancer in the family, it might be something you might need to
absolutely
evaluate if you need to remove it or not. So if you might be wheat sensitive and not gluten sensitivity, there is a way you can kind of figure that out. So the best way to determine if it's wheat or specifically gluten that you are maybe sensitive to is take all your gluten-containing foods out for 2 months, 60 days. At the end of the 60 days, have some barley. Because barley is it's low in FODMAPs. But it's
still got gluten.
Yeah, it's still got gluten in it.
Yeah.
So you'll know if it's more like a wheat issue or a gluten issue that you're having. So have some barley, eat it and see what happens. A few days later, have a piece of wheat bread. So if you don't react to the barley but you react to the wheat, then you're probably more likely going to have a wheat issue than a gluten issue.
Yeah.
So that's one way to sort of decipher if it's wheat or gluten that you're specifically gluten or if it's just wheat that you are reacting to. So that's something you can do. Here's another couple of really cool things that I just put in here.
This is really interesting. Like the whole gluten thing is very interesting stuff, isn't it?
It's very interesting.
And this is another one from Chris Kessler.
Yeah, another one from Chris Kessler.
I
took a really cool resource of his to have a look at because he did a big thing on this. Gluten and the biliary system, so your gallbladder, that type of thing. This is very interesting. So, and I can kind of see a correlation with a few conditions that I treat with fibromyalgia, one, and gallbladder specifically, very strongly connected, and then gluten as well, or wheat gluten. So the cells, so hepatocytes
liver
line
cells.
the bile duct.
Yeah.
They're also connected to tight junctions.
Yeah.
So they make a barrier, permeable barrier between the blood and the biliary system, just
Yep.
like the gut
Yep.
and the tight junctions in the gut. So zonulin can also affect those junctions in the gallbladder area.
Yeah,
so
okay.
that can, if you're having issues, you're having a
Zolin's are the leaky chemicals.
zonulin's a leaky chemical. So
Yep.
we have obviously gap junctions, tight junctions, other areas. So why would it not be affecting that barrier as well? So gliadin, it affects the intestinal barrier, it gets into the bloodstream. It can also have a fairly significant negative effect on epithelial barriers, including the blood biliary barrier, so gallbladder. So if you have a sensitivity to gluten, could you be more inclined to have gallbladder issues?
Oh,
And if you have gallbladder issues, could you look at possibly gluten or wheat sensitivity?
we should have done a podcast on what diseases gluten doesn't affect.
We should have
It'd
actually.
be about 3.
Well, that's true.
It's like all
probably.
of them, from the brain to the gallbladder to the...
It's
just
interesting, isn't
nuts, isn't it?
Yeah. So
Obviously the gut.
yeah, so that's it. So really interesting with that. So okay, so now we go into. I just added these things in because these are some of the things that people talk about. So gluten-free products, right?
Yeah,
so this is a
yes.
whole podcast on its own.
Oh, yeah.
So all right, so say you have a gluten sensitivity and you've figured that out, or you think you may have a gluten sensitivity and you're just going to go on gluten. You're just going to go gluten-free.
Gluten-free, yep.
Just going to go gluten-free. So what I see a lot of times is, and this is where I think the lines get blurred. If someone said, I went gluten-free and I didn't feel any better.
Right.
Right? No difference.
No.
They start loading up on gluten-free products,
Yes.
right? So gluten-free products are highly processed, highly
Very.
refined carbohydrates. They're full of carbohydrates.
Yeah.
They're full of grains.
Yeah.
Gluten-free grains given, but a lot of grains. So we can do another whole podcast on grains specifically, and having a lot of grains in the diet, but they're very high in grains. So they're in themselves, they're quite inflammatory.
Yep.
So you might already have inflammation from if you are sensitive to gluten.
Yep.
So the inflammation is still there. Then you're adding in all these gluten-free, highly refined and processed products.
Yeah.
It's still going to create more inflammation. So
course it will.
probably not going to feel a lot better in a lot of cases. So I got a bit of an example here. So this is just the
this is a good
ingredients.
one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This is ingredients from just an average supermarket brand of gluten-free bread. It's in one of the biggest supermarkets in the country, so very readily available. So this is the ingredients list, right? Water.
So far, so good?
So far, so good. Modified tapioca starch, rice flour, resistant starch, maize starch, soy flour, vegetable oil,
Yuck.
sugar, egg white powder, vinegar, soy protein, dried yeast, vegetable gums, iodized salt, psyllium husk powder, humescent, and preservative.
It's like, and the humectant is glycerine.
Oh, humectant, that's how you say it, is it?
Yeah, glycerine's
I like
the
better.
liquid.
It's because I don't eat these products.
How do you pronounce it?
Humescent.
Oh.
Humectant. Oh, there's T in there.
Humectant.
My new glasses.
Think of humidity, and
Humectant.
it takes the humidity out. It's a
Also, it takes the moisture out of it.
It stops the moisture being active, so it stops microbial growth.
Oh, there you
That's
go.
what humectants do. God.
Glycerine. Is it glycerine?
Yeah, glycerine's a good humectant.
There you
They
go.
put them in protein bars, like cheap ones, not our one.
No.
No,
definitely
but cheap ones because it's a great humectant because it's sweet too. It's liquidy. It goes straight through you because you can buy it from the pharmacy. Glycerine.
Yeah, you can.
It's a nice
Gets things moving.
laxative.
Yeah. So people are taking, they're so, okay, cool, I'm going to have my gluten-free bread for breakfast. I'm going to have gluten-free pasta for lunch or gluten-free, crackers. They're all, a lot of them are quite high in these awful ingredients, which are going to, cause a continuation of your inflammation. So if you want to do gluten-free properly, I would suggest, and we can talk again about grains and things, but we can get our carbohydrates from places other than grains. We don't have to rely completely on grains, so we don't have to have a lot of grains in the diet. There's root vegetables and things like that to contribute to our carbohydrate needs. But find healthy versions and have small amounts. If you're someone that says, I can't live without my toast in the morning, then get some healthy gluten-free toast. And I have another example here of things that you can find that are much healthier.
Okay.
So the ingredients in this one is organic buckwheat meal,
nice.
Organic whole buckwheat kernels, organic rice flour,
No.
buckwheat leavening, and this is all organic, by the way, sunflower oil, which yes or no, and sea salt.
Yum.
That's it.
Yep.
So pretty clean ingredients.
I'd eat that.
Yeah, I'd eat that too.
The other one
I have
with all the
eaten that,
numbers
actually.
on it, a bit dodgy.
Yeah, exactly. So there is ways you can do it. So if you're going to be gluten-free, just don't do it in an unhealthy way, and don't fall for the marketing, because you see in the supermarkets the packets of potato chips that say gluten-free.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, my God, they're gluten-free. I can have them. But the potatoes, they shouldn't have gluten in them anyway. So
whiskey is gluten-free.
That's right.
You know,
so,
it's like, jeez.
And because gluten-free, you know, is everything. So
you know what else is gluten-free?
what?
Every ATP product.
That's true. We don't put gluten in anything.
Nothing.
No.
Nothing.
No, that's
Don't have to
true.
read the label. Not in there.
No, that's exactly right.
Nothing.
Yeah.
Isn't that amazing?
That is amazing. So if you're going to be gluten-free, just be careful about the amount of gluten-free products and have clean products. So that's one thing. And then the other issue with if you're going gluten-free and I just still feel terrible. A lot of the grains have high oxalates.
Oh, the oxalates.
So the oxalates can be a problem for a lot of people. And if you're taking in a lot of these foods, you know, you can have joint pain, inflammation, that type of thing if you're susceptible. So that's another thing to be mindful of. Inflammation can take months to reduce. So if you take away a trigger, your inflammation isn't going to go away in 3 days. So if you're taking out gluten and then you're still inflamed, putting in more probably inflammatory foods is not going to help. So that can be some of the reasons going gluten-free makes no difference. Another reason is it can take a little while for gluten to leave the system. So, I'd give it a month to have that sort of inflammation and everything go down before you would start to see, even 2 months before you start to see more improvement if you are going gluten-free. And then I put this in because this was kind of a little bit of a discussion topic too. Why do we see more and more sensitivities to gluten or wheat these days? We're seeing a lot of sensitivities. So
even to nuts and everything.
Everything. So many things. I mean, there's a lot more inflammatory conditions. There's a lot more allergic conditions. There's so many more conditions that are coming out these days. And these are my theories only, but high stress, such a stressful world that we live in, fast pace, money, everything is a lot of stress for people. That causes more issues with digestion. Obviously, we've talked about that in the past, which can reduce digestive function, which can then cause dysbiosis, it can cause inflammation, and then gut hyperpermeability, and then inflammatory conditions, sensitivities to gluten and other things that perhaps people weren't going to be, more toxins, that sort of thing. And the other thing, gluten's in more than just breads and pastas and crackers. It's in sauces, it's in thickeners, it's in shampoos and beauty products.
Shampoo?
Yeah, it's in shampoo.
I used to make shampoo. I didn't know
as
gluten.
a thickener.
Really?
Yeah, like wheat proteins and things like that as well. So people, it's in everything. So people are getting glutened a lot, like a lot of gluten intake. So I think, like anything, too much of anything can be a bad thing.
Yeah.
And I think I'll use the example of the paleo movement. The paleo movement was about, and everyone's like, I'm cutting my grains out and that's it, not having, and they all ran out and bought bags and bags of almond flour. No grains, just nuts and, seeds and all that healthy fats. And I like the paleo diet.
Yeah, I had a lot of nuts too.
Yeah, a lot of nuts done correctly. But they were replacing their gluten or their wheat flour with almond flour.
Wow.
And so then you're having a huge amount of almonds and almond flour, which are very high in oxalates and other things. So that's kind of the same sort of thing. You're replacing one poison with another poison. And then we're overall just more inflamed because of the way we live than we used to be. So anything is going to be more of a trigger. Yeah. So there's some of the reasons why I think possibly we're seeing more of these sensitivities. Yeah. So, and then finally, how can you tell if you...
Where's this special test you were talking about?
How do you find out if you're gluten sensitive or not? Take gluten out of your diet.
Yeah.
It's a pretty easy way to do it.
World.
Yeah. And as I said, don't load it up with highly refined or for gluten-free products. Yeah. Just get some clean products. Don't overload the amount that you're having. Have a nice, healthy, balanced diet with vegetables and fruits and proteins and things like that. They say about a 2-week elimination, but I would go further. I would go maybe even 2 months, particularly if you're quite inflamed. And then when the inflammation is going down or subsiding, then add a little bit of gluten back in and see how you go for a few days. And if you feel fine, add a bit more in. If you find you continue to be fine and no issues, then you probably don't have an issue with gluten itself, but maybe an inflammatory issue, which you've got to look at. If you do react, then that's pretty much your answer. So then you take it back out. And you look for reasons why. Because just because you react to gluten now doesn't mean that you will always react to it.
Sure.
And we're not saying you have to go gluten-free, and it's not a pro-gluten-free podcast. It's just a look at the evidence for both ways and don't demonise it and ridicule people who are gluten-free, because we've shown that there are definitely a lot of reasons and a lot of conditions that are affected by gluten and wheat in a negative way. It's a really
good summary because, as I said, it's not just your gut either. It's your brain. It can be, gallbladder. It's a systemic disease, gluten insensitivity.
Yeah.
I mean, but it's a great summary at the end. You summarise it really well. I don't know what to add to that. It's just brilliant how, check it out. Cut it out yourself.
Yeah. And
you're not going to miss anything.
You're not going to miss anything, and that's it. And like we said, take gluten out of your diet. And I have had clients say to me, but I don't know what to eat. I'm like, well, you should be eating fruits and vegetables and your starchy carbohydrates and things like that. And those different types, there's so many different fibres, different types of fibres in your fruits and vegetables alone.
Yeah.
Same type of fibres that you're getting in your grains. So, do it properly. Work with the dietitian, work with the nutritionist, any practitioner that can help guide you to do it properly instead of just trying to do it on your own.
And if you're struggling to read the labels, how about you get foods without labels?
Exactly.
Apple doesn't have a label.
It doesn't have a label, no.
Neither do vegetables.
And if you're reading a label and you just need to stand there for 5 minutes, then I'd probably put it back. If it's got more than 4 or 5 ingledients, probably
you've got numbers, you're going, what's 621?
Yeah, exactly.
Jeez. And that's MSG, by the way.
That's right, exactly. So, gluten isn't bad for some people, but other people it can be very bad.
Yep.
And they don't have to have celiac disease. It's not just confined to people who have celiac disease that have issues. There is definitely, as we've shown, a lot of populations that have issues. So, in some instances I'm gluten-free or sensitive to gluten, then perhaps maybe be a little bit more sympathetic to them rather than just, which a lot of people get, is just ridiculed. I'm gluten-free.
Yeah.
So for a reason. I do have sensitivities to gluten. I never used to, but I do now. I took it out after I finished competing when I was a bit still recovering and that sort of thing. And now if I have gluten, I actually get really painful skin.
Oh.
Yeah, so all my skin hurts like I've been beaten.
Dermatitis, think.
No, it doesn't. So I don't know visual, but it's sensitivity. So it feels like I've been beaten. Wow. Yeah, so if I have any I can have a little bit, but I just avoid it primarily because for me, I know that I react to it. And I actually don't find it difficult. And that's the other thing we didn't talk about. People say, but it's so hard to be gluten-free in society. And I get it if you're going out, particularly if you're younger, and you're going out with friends and there's pressure to eat the food. And, a lot of times they eat food that's probably not amazing when they're younger.
Yeah.
And they say it's too hard. But I honestly don't even think about it anymore. No. If you get to the point and you have to be gluten-free, you do have to be, then you get to the point where you don't think about it. I can go out no problem. And look, I don't have celiac disease. That's a whole other issue. You've got to be very careful.
Very careful. But
if you're just sensitive, I find it's not too hard. You get quite used to it. You don't think about it after a while. You know what you can and can't eat. So there's definitely ways around it. So I think gluten-free is not that bad. Don't down the people. There's good reasons for it. Find out if it's gluten or wheat that you're sensitive to. And if you are, then work around that. As I said, work with somebody that can help you to have a balanced diet and still get all your nutrients in there if you're not having the gluten. So
and you don't have to miss out on life.
You don't have to miss that on life, no.
Oh, that's great, Nic. Well, it's been terrific. And it's far more involved than I thought it was.
For me too, we did some research for it. I thought there is a lot. I mean, there is a lot of really good research for gluten causing issues for a lot of people.
Gluten, geez, who knew?
So there you go.
That's about all we've got time for this week.
Yeah.
We'll see you next week.
See you next week, guys.
Bye.
Bye.